A girl and her dog found two cops buried alive. What she did next astonished everyone. Snow needled Lila Crane's face as the ridge funneled wind like a whispering blade. 10 years old, and moving with the wary calm her father drilled into her. Titan ranged ahead, an aging Malinois with a torn collar tag, and the kind of silence that meant he'd already decided something was wrong. The world felt held between breaths. Pines rigid, sky the color of tarnished steel, the trail a white ribbon disappearing into the coming blizzard. Titan halted so sharply that Lila almost stumbled into him. One bark, short, explosive, then he launched toward a drift shaped like a Calais roof. She clawed after him, mittens soaking, and saw it. A wrist with purpled skin, a watch spider webbed with ice, the corner of a badge catching a shard of light, another shape beside it, tape bit into mouths and wrists, snow packed around faces, breath scraping in weak, uneven puffs. Titan planted himself over the bodies, chest heaving, amber eyes burning like coals. Lila's mind split into two clean lines. Help them now, and find out who did this before the storm erased the story. Clues whispered from the edges. A tire scar sliced across the switchback, fresh, heavy, then abruptly gone as if a vehicle had been lifted from the road. A torn shipping tag skittered under a branch, the letters VA, smeared with something dark. Deeper in the drift, Lila's fingers brushed a burner phone, so cold it burned, its cracked screen flickering with one unsent message. Crane knows, her last name, not her father's first, not which Crane at all. Titan's ears pricked toward the timberline where a second set of footprints waited, small, careful, and circling back like a test. Lila tasted metal on her tongue and realized this wasn't random. It was a warning she was never meant to find. What happened next will shock you. Where are you reading this from? Subscribe to never miss a story. Lila Crane moved along the ridge, with a wiry steadiness born of long winters, knit cap pulled low, hazel eyes narrowed against powder the wind teased from drifts. Titan paced beside her, a grizzled Malinois with a worn collar and the unhurried confidence of a retired partner who still read danger in the air. Pines stooped under fresh weight, needles glazed, trunks striped with rime. The sky hung metallic gray. Caleb Crane had taught her to hear weather, to treat it like a stern teacher rather than an enemy. He had radioed from the outpost before school let out, voice steady but clipped, telling her a heavier band would arrive by dark. Keep to the flagged trail, he said. Move with purpose. Let Titan lead if visibility drops. The outpost waited below, a low timber building braced with stone, radio mast needling the pale sky. Titan glanced back, and Lila scratched the stiff fur at his neck, feeling a ridge of old scars. He had been a working dog for years, a quiet expert at finding what did not want to be found, and guarding what others could not afford to lose. Retirement softened his schedule, not his instincts. When his ears pricked and his gait shortened, Lila matched him without thinking. At a bend where the trail hooked around a granite slab, Titan stopped hard enough that she bumped his flank. He inhaled once, then again, slow and deep. His hackles lifted in a quiet wave. Lila waited, chin tucked, eyes scanning the water. A smell reached her that did not belong to weather or trees. Metallic breath and adhesive, the sterile ghost of tape, the cold scent that lives on coins. Titan stepped off the marked path, testing the drift with careful weight, and Lila followed by placing her boots in his prints. The hollow appeared after 3 strides, a bowl scooped by wind behind the fallen crown of a pine. Snow swelled and slumped around the bowl in uneven plains. A slice of blue sleeve showed, vanished, showed again. Titan gave one short walk. Lila dropped to her knees and brushed with the heel of her hand, clearing faces, not digging down. Iced lashes framed skin the color of porcelain. A faint fog touched the air near a mouth sealed with tape, glazed by frost. A badge glinted under a thin film. The second body lay inches away, coat twisted, wrists banded, breath barely there. She spoke her name and the dog's name. She said help was coming, said it like a promise she would not allow the world to break. Titan shouldered into the wind so it hit him first, warming the narrow corridor where the faces lay. Lila slid off her pack, Caleb's insistence had weight in the small things she carried. Bandages, chemical warmers, paracord, a thermos wrapped in wool. She snapped off her mittens, worked bare fingers into motion, and unlatched the thermos. Steam lifted with the smell of strong tea and a sliver of orange. She poured a ribbon over the tape, at the first mouth, warming adhesive without flooding the airway, waiting, then lifting slowly, coaxing the edge rather than ripping. The tape softened and peeled away in grudging millimeters until skin showed where glue had stuck. The second month got the same careful treatment. She slid a scarf beneath chilled cheeks to keep ice from skin and tucked it under collars for a barrier. The badge under her glove read Detective Nora Holt. The wallet she teased from the other coat, warmed between her palms for a breath, held a shield for Detective Elias Ward. Names anchored the moment and argued against panic. Lila pressed the radio button and waited for the crackle. "Base, this is Lila. I need my father." Static answered first. Then Caleb's voice landed with the weight of boots on a porch. He didn't waste phrases. "Position." She gave landmarks. Granite slab with green lichen. Double drift behind the felled pine. Lean east, and you can just see the mast. He understood. She could hear the decision in the way he breathed. Snowmobiles. Rescue sleds. Owen Blake is bringing the trauma kit. Tessa Reed is scouting the switchbacks. Hold steady. Keep talking. She clicked twice to save battery and words. The ridge glowered overhead like a steel spine. Lila quickened her hands. Tea dampened the tape until her thumb could lift it without skin tearing. A wheeze answered, weak, stubborn. She set warmers in the armpits and along the ribs, wrapped Holt's neck with her scarf, then draped her coat over both bodies and wormed herself above the edges to cut drafts. Titan lay along their shins, heat seeping through fur and fabric. Every few seconds he looked toward the timberline, toward the trail, toward the valley, triangulating threats and routes with old habits. Lila checked wrists where the bindings bit. She didn't cut yet. Circulation had to return slowly. She rubbed fingers, pinched lobes, murmured steady things people could hold. Ordinary images, strong enough to pull breath back to a chest. Summer at the creek, pancakes on Sunday, batter bubbling, syrup warming on the stove. A brief lull made the snow hush deep. Up on the bend, tire tracks sliced the crust. Heavy tread pressed clean, then smeared by spindrift. A scrap of plastic tag clung to a twig. Black letters smudged where damp had blurred them. She imagined the drag, the attempt to bury without burying fully. The radio clicked again. 2 minutes, Caleb said. Hold your ground. She could hear engines now, faint at first, then rising. She breathed in, breathed out, and kept her hands moving. Holt's eyes fluttered. Lila brought the cup close and let steam wet the cracked lips, then touched a drop towards tongue. Careful about the angle. Color changed by degrees. Less gray. Titan's ears went forward. Headlights crept along the switchback and threw pale bars through the tree. Relief almost buckled her knees. But habits held. She kept clearing the airways and kept speaking. Engines cut. Voices arrived. Snow shook from the branches when the first rescuer slid into the hollow. Caleb's face appeared above the rim. Brows knotted. Mouth set. Eyes soft. The way they got when he saw both little girl and partner. He squeezed her shoulder once and then turned to the work. Owen unrolled blankets. Tessa anchored a sled, and they moved like a single body, lifting, bracing, securing. Lila stepped back only when Caleb told her to, then tucked herself near Titan, and kept watch over the ridge that had tried to keep its secret. The storm thickened again. Snow erased the last faint trace of the tracks on the bend. The outpost would be loud and bright when they reached it. The stove booming, radios alive, doors swinging as people did what needed doing. Out here the moment flipped quiet. Lila pressed a palm to Titan's shoulder, feeling the old machine of his heart keep its exacting time. They had found 2 lives the weather meant to take. They had tilted the balance. As the sled slid out of the hollow, she knew this was a hinge. Ahead, the ridge waited, steep, white, and listening. Caleb's first glimpse of the hollow turned urgency into muscle memory as he swung off the snowmobile, shoved his goggles to his brow, and knelt beside the two figures, while engines thrummed behind him, and the wind poured spindrift over the rim like ground glass. Lila held her scarf tight around Detective Nora Holt's neck, tucked the tail beneath Detective Elias Ward's jaw to block drafts, and kept speaking in a steady murmur about warmth and home. Titan planted himself between Storm and bodies, amber eyes fierce, breath fogging and even pulses as if he were metering the air for everyone. Medic Owen Blake slid down with a compact kit, checked airways, set warming packs in armpits and along ribs, and nodded once to signal that the beats he felt were faint yet stubborn. Tessa Reed, lean and sharp-eyed, took Caleb's radio, marked their position, and scanned the tray line where snow crawled across the ground like smoke. "We move now," Caleb said, voice low. Decisions nested inside each clipped word. He and Owen cinched straps around the first sled, counting breaths between gusts, while Tessa planted flags toward a traverse that might hold if they distributed weight. Lila, small and wiry, held the thermos near Holt's mouth, so steam could soften cracked lips without flooding a chilled throat, then pressed her palm towards sternum to feel the stubborn lift of breath. "Stay with us," she whispered, and Titan answered with a low rumble that sounded like an oath. Snow thickened until pines blurred into slate pillars, and the sky turned metallic, erasing depth. Their world narrowed to the path they made and the lives they refused to surrender. They lifted Holt first, timing the push to the lull between gusts, Caleb riding the tail with boots as rudders, while Owen steadied shoulders and Lila paced beside Titan just ahead, watching for where white crusts shaded to deceitful gray. Tessa moved like a stitch across the slope, tapping the pole, planting another strip of fabric, waving the line forward or freezing them with a palm when the surface moaned. Halfway to the switchback, the wind lay down for 3 heartbeats and rose again with teeth in that brief hush. Caleb spotted a diagonal scar across the bend where heavy tires had chewed the crust before veering into trees. He felt suspicion settle like a weight in his coat. He marked the angle with his eye, then drove the sled into the lee of a granite shoulder where the gale broke, and they paused to adjust straps and check color. Under the stone he eased Holt's coat and saw the badge again, the shield winking once in flat light. Then he fished out the wallet from Ward's inner pocket and confirmed the identity card. Nora Holt, Elias Ward. City detectives are a long way from their death. Warmth reached Holt's throat. A raw whisper carried a fragment. "Investigation," she said. "Illegal timber, unlisted shipments, a meet with a source, then 3 masked men boxing our vehicle on a spur road." Ward added one clipped name, the label he had seen stamped in ink on crates and printed on forged manifests: Vance Logistics. Caleb looked at Lila. She met his gaze without flinching, then returned to her careful work as if the only answer to dread was competence. They pushed again, the traverse pinching at a choke where cornices overhung a drop. Tessa's flag stitched a slender path through the throat, and Caleb guided the sled along it while Owen absorbed jolts with his knees and Lila kept talking about pancakes in a stove that boomed like thunder when the first log caught flame. Titan matched her cadence, ears angling toward any click from the timber line. A single clink traveled across the wind. Not branch, not ice, something metallic meeting stone and then nothing. Caleb filed it without breaking rhythm. They reached the outpost yard at a pewter dusk. Stone walls threw back heat. Lamps burned behind windows. The chimney sent a straight plume into the weather. Doors swung, benches cleared, blankets layered across cots, and the room filled with the brisk choreography of people who knew their role. Owen transferred Holt to one bed and Ward to another, started warm fluids, recorded vitals on a clipboard that Lila held steady, and guided slow sips from the lid of the thermos. Titan lay between cots, a living barrier, eyes moving while his body stayed rock still. Tessa pinned a paper map to the wall and circled the switchback in red pencil, then drew a dotted line through the trees to a faded spur that dropped toward an old lumber yard. If they loaded there, they could bypass the main road, she said. Caleb stepped to the table, laid out evidence bags, and opened one hand to reveal the scrap Lila had found earlier, a torn shipping tag with V and A ghosted by damp yet legible. "When you knew what to read for." Holt's face sharpened. "That's it," she breathed. They used a shell to hide permits, shifted cut logs as salvage, and pushed premium timber across county lines at night. Ward squeezed Lila's fingers. His voice was hoarse but steady when he thanked her. Caleb kept the briefing simple. We stabilize our guests, photograph the bend before drifts swallow tread, notify federal partners, and prepare for visitors who prefer to witness quiet. He assigned Owen to continue medical work, Tessa to sketch a wider perimeter starting at the tire scar, and himself to document the route and collect casts, if the temperature allowed. Before stepping out, he crouched by Holt's bed. We'll move this forward, he said. We won't let the ridge erase what it tried to hide. Outside, snow kept falling in patient crystals that blurred edges and softened every track within minutes. At the gate, a half-covered boot print, different from the maintenance crew's pattern, angled toward the ridge path, the heel marked by a small nick that repeated every few steps. Caleb traded a glance with Tessa that said later, then they headed for the switchback while the light thinned. The scar remained visible, a gouge with crisp shoulders as if cut by teeth. He stretched a tape across the tread to capture width, photographed from low angles to preserve relief, then brushed a skin of powder to find parallel scratches that ran inside the trench. Skid rails, he said softly. Loaded sled pulled by a machine, heavy and quick. Beyond the bend, he found where the trench seemed to vanish, only to resume behind a clump of firs that hid the mouth of the faded spur. He photographed that too, then knelt and lifted a curled fleck of black plastic embossed with a partial serial string. He bagged it and wrote the coordinates on the label. Back at the outpost, Owen had guided both patients into a steadier rhythm, and Lila had refilled the therma. Titan had not moved far. He watched every opening door as if each hinge could decide the night. Caleb set the bagged scrap beside the badges, and summarized what the bend had told him. Holt's eyes brightened with something separate from heat. There rote cuts behind the official spur, she whispered. They drop under the old yard, and load where no one bothers to look. The radio crackled with a weather update, bands converging, visibility dropping after dark. Caleb called the Federal Dispatch, left a concise report with coordinates, and requested immediately on without broadcast chatter. He ended the call with a simple line that tasted like iron. 2 detectives assaulted and left to die. Silence followed, then a promise to route agents when roads allowed. Lila stood straighter, as if the words themselves were a kind of heat. Have you ever faced a moment where courage was your only choice? She asked softly, eyes on Holt and Ward, but voice pitched for a wider circle her father could not see. Sheer below, no one answered the line as a question. Instead, the room settled into a focus that felt like consent. Caleb returned to the map and traced a gloved finger from the switchback to the spur, then to the yard, then out to the service road that joined the highway. They needed cover, speed, and a short window between patrols, he said. This pattern gives all three. Tessa added a note about a blind curve near the yard, where a lookout could watch both approaches. She drew a small X at a cut bank that would hide a parked vehicle from passing lights. Owen closed his kit, wiped his hands, and looked at Caleb. They knew exactly where to leave them, he said. Not far enough to vanish, just far enough to freeze before anyone wandered off the trail. Caleb felt that weight again, heavier now that faces had color and names had voices. He stepped to the porch for a final scan before full dark. Snow muted the yard. Trees hunched under a new load. Wind combed the mast and made the wires sing a thin note. On the lower fence rail, the same boot print appeared again, faint, headed away this time toward the creek draw that paralleled the spur. Whoever had paced there had lingered long enough to smoke or think, or both. Caleb followed the sign for 20 yards, then lost it to drift. He stood still and listened. Far off, something thumped once, then again, as if a board had swung on a loose chain. He marked the bearing, and returned inside. Holt had one more fragment to offer. They said a name, she said. Not to us, to each other, like a reminder to stay cold. She swallowed and closed her eyes. Vance, Ward nodded, jaw tightening. A polished voice behind the paperwork, he said. Money on wheel. Caleb wrote the name on the board below the map, and underlined it once. Then he looked at Lila, at Titan, at the 2 beds, at the flags Tessa had planted against a moving white world, and felt the ridge lean closer as if listening. The ridge kept its counsel. Snow surged across the ridge like blown salt, while Caleb's crew strapped Nora Holt and Elias Ward into rigid rescue sleds, buckles cinched, blankets layered, oxygen lines taped, and hoods pulled down to guard frostbitten skin. Engines revved as Owen Blake checked pulses, slipped warming packs along ribs, and braced a gloved hand against each jaw during jolts. Tessa Reed snowshoed ahead, probing cornices with a pole, planting fabric flags that snapped sideways, then vanished inside white roar. Lila clung to Titan's ruff near the sled tails, breath pluming, whispering steady promises into the storm. Hold on, help waits, warmth is coming, this path will not break. Caleb rode behind Holt's rig with boots as rudders, eyes never leaving the traverse that corkscrewed across a slope, where fir crowns bowed under load, and the sky looked hammered from dull steel. A gust shoved the column, scattering grit of ice against the goggles. Owen called for a slow notch, pressed a stethoscope under the padding, nodded, then waved for throttle. Tessa cut left around a drift shaped like a frozen wave, found firmer crust, and marked it with another strip of fabric. Every meter demanded a trade between speed and safety, yet the clinic lay miles below, and daylight shortened by the heartbeat. At the choke near the switchback, the wind screamed so fiercely that voices flattened into pantomime. Lila leaned close to Titan's ear and said the simple things that had carried them through storms before. Pancakes on Sunday, maple syrup warming on a stove, the thump of boots beside the door, a laugh caught in steam. Titan pressed forward, amber eyes fierce, body a wedge holding space against the gale for Nora and Elias. Sled runners chattered over crust, then hissed through powder, then jolted across buried root. Caleb glanced upslope and saw a slur of tread scars where a heavy machine had chewed an exit through trees, then cut toward a faded spur that dropped toward an old yard. He filed that mark for later, concentrated on getting human cargo down alive. The first traverse ended at a notch between granite shoulders, where snow settled and visibility improved from blindness to dim tunnel vision. Owen squinted at Holt's face, lifted an eyelid, and spoke her name. A rasp crawled out from under cracked lips. Masked men, she gasped, words breaking apart like ice plates. Boxstar car dragged us off the road, crates without numbers, manifests that don't exist. The admission faded, then steadied into a faint wheeze. Unlisted shipment. Lila tightened her scarf around Holt's throat and murmured, "You're safe, breathe with me." In out. She touched Ward's shoulder and repeated the rhythm, watching that tiny rise under quilts like a lighthouse blink. Caleb radioed ahead to the clinic, transmitted vitals, frost injury grades, and ETA. Static crowded the channel. A nurse answered with clear steps, warm room ready, IVs primed, generator fueled, doors. Think of someone who needs hope today. Share this story, Lila whispered, almost to herself as if sending a message through the gale. Tessa waved them forward again. They snaked along a narrow shelf where a cornice overhung a drop into timber, proceeding in short bursts timed to lull. A crosswind shoved Holt's sled toward the lip. Caleb drove his weight through the tow line, boots cutting deep, shoulders burning, while Titan lunged to the downhill side and braced, claws biting crust, growl low and constant like a diesel under load. The rig was corrected by inches. Owen shoved a wedge under the runner, reset the straps and signaled ready. Another push, another pause, and at last the shelf widened into a wind shadow behind a ridge of stone. Lila kept up her whispering reel, not as filler but as anchor, a quilt warmed by a fire, cocoa foaming in a mug, cinnamon on the air, the soft cluck of a kettle. Holt's hands trembled under the blanket and then settled. Ward coughed and tried to form a name that came out as crushed syllable. Owen tipped a few drops against his tongue, gauged a swallow, and waited for the next breath before giving another. Caleb lifted his phone while engines idled, and typed a message he had delayed sending for too many winters. "Nathan, I need answers," he wrote. "Your drivers, your contractors, any link to a company called Vance Logistics." Two detectives pulled from a drift near the old spur. "This touches our land." He watched the screen until snow dusted the glass. The reply landed like a door slamming from inside a house. "Stay out of it. Nothing else. No, you're safe. No, what happened? Only that flat wall." Caleb studied the word string as if it carried fingerprints. Then he pocketed the phone and signaled the line to move. The road steepened through a stand of bent spruce where drifts lay in layered plates. Tessa hopped down, tested edges, and carved a channel with her shovel so runners wouldn't skate sideways. Engines bellowed. Sleds shot forward, then slowed, then crept. Lila's thighs burned, She matched Titan's cadence and refused to look at the drop. The dog glanced back and she gave him a bare nod. A contract renewed without language. An hour that felt like 10 pressed past before the trees thinned and a dim smear of sodium light showed on the valley floor. Wind dropped from scream to growl. Snow still fell, yet the world had edges again. The clinic squatted at the end of a plowed lane, low and stout, with drifts banked to its window sills, and a generator churning behind a lattice of ice. Doors flew open, hands pulled sleds inside. A blast of furnace heat thumped cheeks and fogged goggles. Nurses cut bindings with blunt scissors, peeled layers, guided IV lines, fitted warm masks, and hung fluids that steamed in the air above clear drips. Owen took the left bay with Holt, passed quick notes to the charge nurse, and began a slow rewarming protocol. Tessa transferred Ward to the right bay, helped hoist him, then trotted back outside to park the machines under the overhang. Caleb spoke to the admitting clerk in short lines, gave names, times, coordinates, and a summary of what they had found on the slope. Lila stood between the beds, with Titan at her shins, a small pillar at the exact center of the room. Holt's eyes flickered open again, wider this time, seeing ceiling lights, masks, a dog's triangular head, a girl's steadfast face. They followed our case, she whispered. Movements tracked, radio traffic mirrored. Unlisted shipments left the spur at night, cut across the drainages, slipped to private mills with falsified permits. We were going to meet a driver, who'd flip. A tremor climbed her arm. Lila set her palm lightly over the blanket above Holt's wrist, until the tremor eased. Ward, barely conscious, breathed two words that sounded like gravel. Crates stenciled. Van. Caleb stood straighter, not triumph but confirmation, the way a carpenter checks a level and sees the bubble land dead center. He rubbed a hand over his jaw and considered the message he had received from his brother. Nathan owned a regional lumber firm that touched every spur around it. Snow pressed the windows while the team worked, and hope held fast. En la clínica, el aire olía a desinfectante, café recalentado y lana mojada, y aunque las calefacciones vibraban, el frío parecía haber llegado pegado a Nora Holt y Elias Ward, y negarse a salir. Ambos recobraban color bajo mantas térmicas, sueros tibios y mascarillas, que marcaban un ritmo discreto, mientras Owen Blake anotaba constantes con pulso firme, y Tessa Reed cerraba corrientes de aire. Hablaba con la central y mantenía despejado el pasillo de entrada por si aparecían visitantes no deseados. Lila, con las mejillas aún rojas, permanecía entre las dos camillas junto a Titan, rascándole el cuello áspero cada vez que el Malinois fijaba la vista en la puerta como si esperara que la tormenta misma empujara el marco. Le susurraba promesas sencillas, el tipo de imágenes que sostienen el ánimo cuando la noche no se trató, una estufa encendida, chocolate espeso, pan dorado, el sonido de botas chorreando en el felpudo. Nora abrió los ojos apenas, y asintió un recuerdo incompleto. Elias, pálido, pero más estable, movió los dedos como si confirmara que el cuerpo aún respondía a llamadas importantes. Caleb Crane salió un momento al porche, encajó el gorro, miró el cielo de acero y decidió volver a la curva donde había visto huellas de ruedas pesadas cortando la nieve como un tajo nuevo. Avisó por radio, comprobó batería de la linterna y se internó por el sendero que conducía a la cota, dejando a Owen de guardia, a Tessa controlando la puerta trasera, y a Lila prometiendo que no se movería del lado de los detectives. Titan lo siguió sin pedir permiso, pegado a la pierna como sombra con memoria de servicio, avanzando con la cabeza baja, la nariz trabajando por franjas hasta que la noche devolvió señales mínimas. Resina húmeda, metal frío, goma reciente. La nevada había difuminado márgenes, pero las marcas seguían allí, anchas, frescas en el fondo y apenas veladas en la superficie. Caleb midió con mirada de oficio el ancho de la pisada, fotografió ángulos, y encontró el punto donde el rastro se perdía a propósito para reaparecer detrás de un grupo de abetos que ocultaban la boca de un ramal antiguo hacia los almacenes de la vieja explotación maderera. Siguió ese corredor de sombra y hielo hasta un cobertizo que gemía al compás del viento, paredes grises, tejado hundido por placas, puerta lateral mal cerrada con un alambre nuevo. Titan marcó con un gruñido bajo que el lugar no estaba vacío de historias. Caleb empujó con cuidado y dejó que el haz de la linterna pintara mesas, clavos, tambores y lo vio, un charco seco de color cobrizo cerca de un banco de trabajo, gotas endurecidas que brillaban como vidrio, arrastre en el suelo hacia la salida posterior, y sobre un tablón fajo de papeles sellados con tinta borrosa y números limpios que no cuadraban con nada. Alzó el primer formulario y la luz se clavó en un encabezado que no pedía traducción. Vance Logistic. Había listas de carga con rutas inexistentes, firmas clonadas, sellos repetidos con fechas invertidas, y notas a lápiz que describían desvíos nocturnos por el mismo ramal que acababa de pisar. Titan rascó una grieta junto a la mesa, del hueco salió un trozo de cinta industrial manchada, y muy adentro entre serrín y telarañas, un mechón de fibra oscura pegado a una rebaba seco pero reciente, como si alguien hubiera intentado limpiarse la sangre con guantes ásperos antes de marcharse a toda prisa. Caleb embolsó cada pieza, fotografió, y dejó las páginas abiertas para tomar una panorámica que mostrara la hilera de firmas falsas repitiéndose con la precisión de un sello malicioso. Afuera la tormenta latía contra los muros, y detrás de los tamariscos, un motor velado por la nieve regulaba un ralentí perfecto. El conductor observaba con paciencia de pescador. No era un improvisado, ni un capataz, era el dueño del tablero. Vance, abrigo oscuro, corbata mansa, reloj que pesaba lo justo, se inclinaba sobre unos prismáticos compactos y hacía cálculos de tiempo como quien cuenta pasos en un corredor vigilado. Sus teléfonos sin nombre esperaban una orden. En el asiento trasero, una carpeta con copias de facturas falsas, mapas con anotaciones finas y una lista breve de personas a silenciar se mantenía cerrada con un broche magnético. Vance sabía que la nieve se come la evidencia si uno administra minutos con inteligencia. Sabía también que con 2 detectives vivos, el margen se estrechaba. Encendió la luz del techo apenas lo necesario para escribir una nota en la cubierta de la carpeta, mover apoyo, revisar cámara en el acceso norte, cerrar cabos. No sonrió. La satisfacción era para gente vulgar. Apagó la luz y volvió a mirar el cobertizo. Caleb llamó a la Central Federal por la frecuencia segura, informó con precisión de coordenadas, describió el hallazgo, citó la compañía, habló de los detectives, de la agresión, del intento de ocultar el rastro bajo la ventisca, y pidió equipo forense, apoyo en carretera y verificación de permisos en aserraderos privados. La respuesta llegó con retardo, cortada por la ionización que daba la tormenta, pero bastó. Recibimos. En camino. Mantengan posición con discreción. Caleb cortó, guardó el rad y dejó que Titan volviera a indicar con la mirada la puerta posterior. La hoja había sido forzada recientemente, y tras ella, el pasillo angosto llevaba a un muelle, donde quedaban marcas semicirculares de neumático pulido, 2 medias lunas oscuras, aún húmedas pese al frío, y en el borde migas de hielo con olor a escape. Hizo otra foto, recogió una viruta negra con letras en relieve, y se detuvo a escuchar. El bosque suena distinto cuando alguien respira cerca. El perro tensó el lomo, la cola recta y lanzó un gruñido corto hacia la arboleda densa. Caleb no vio nada, solo sombras amasadas por la nevada, pero supo que no estaba solo. Cerró el muelle con el cerrojo de dentro para ganar segundos si algo se precipitaba y volvió al frente, donde las páginas con el membrete comprometedor esperaban dentro de fundas plásticas. Pensó en Nora señalando, envío sin listar, en Elías tratando de articular. Vance, en la curva, en el arrastre, en la cinta, en la sangre seca, en Lila permaneciendo firme en la clínica con Titan ausente por primera vez de su lado. ¿Cuál fue un momento en el que confiaste en tu instinto? Cuéntanos abajo, murmuró, y al decirlo entendió que cada paso desde la curva hasta esa mesa había sido guiado por la terquedad luminosa de la niña y por la nariz obstinada del perro. Volvió a guardar el fajo, marcó con pintura fosforescente el lateral del cobertizo para que el equipo llegara sin dudas, y emprendió el retorno con cuidado, moviéndose entre ráfagas, que convertían el paisaje en un mapa que alguien borraba delante de sus botas. En la clínica, Nora exhaló más hondo, Elías recuperó temperatura en los dedos, y Lila calentó entre sus manos la tapa del termo, antes de apoyar 2 gotas sobre la lengua del detective, para ayudar al reflejo. Owen asentía sin palabras, reconociendo la clase de tenacidad que no figura en manuales. Tessa, atenta al pasillo,
Guardó el móvil tras leer una notificación de carretera cortada y empujó una mesa para despejar el giro de camilla por si había que evacuar con urgencia. Vance siguió el rastro del faro que parpadeó cuando Caleb volvió a encender la linterna al salir del cobertizo, y anotó la duración exacta del registro. Después desbloqueó uno de los teléfonos, marcó y dijo con voz neutra que la madrugada pedía ajustes, movimiento mínimo cerca del ramal, quitar restos en el muelle, limpiar el banco de trabajo, verificar que no quedaran cámaras en el LIM, sobre todo localizar a los dos de la clínica cuanto antes. Si respiran al amanecer, todo el bosque hablará, añadió. Colgó, y apoyó la frente un segundo contra el cristal frío, no por cansancio sino por cálculo. El SUV giró muy despacio entre árboles, sin luces, y alejó sin dejar más testimonio que una línea efímera que la ventisca empezó a tragar. Caleb llegó a la clínica con los formularios en una bolsa sellada y el mechón dentro de otro sobre pequeño. Dejó ambos en manos de Owen, pidió a Tessa que fotografiara la portada con la palabra delatora, y entró en la sala con la ropa aún chisporroteando. Lila se levantó y le agarró la manga, buscando en su cara la respuesta a una pregunta que nadie había formulado. Él no exageró ni maquilló nada. Tenemos ruta, sello y nombre, dijo. Pedí federales. Hay ojos en el bosque. Titan, al oír la palabra bosque, se acercó a la puerta y se sentó de guardia. Afuera la noche se apretó contra los cristales como si quisiera mirar dentro. Adentro, la evidencia ocupó la mesa central con una gravedad limpia que ni el frío logró enturbiar.
La nueva ventisca llegó al anochecer, como una tapia lanzada desde el cielo sobre el puesto de guardabosques, borrando la huella del camino y haciendo que el bosque pareciera una sola masa de tiza en movimiento. El viento tiró de las vigas, hizo que el cristal del ventanal vibrara con un zumbido continuo y empujó la nieve contra el porche, hasta levantar un talud brillante. Caleb echó el cerrojo, comprobó el nivel de diésel del generador y dividió a los presentes por tareas sencillas. Owen ocupó el control de signos en un cuarto interior. Tessa revisó los accesos. Lila mantuvo caliente el termo y acercó mantas a los dos detectives para que el calor no se desperdiciara. Titan se tumbó de cara a la puerta como un guardián viejo que no olvida su oficio, y Nora y Elias respiraron un poco mejor bajo capas ordenadas con cuidado. La radio crepitó 2 veces, luego murió en un chasquido seco. La tormenta había mordido la antena o había tendido una cortina de ruido sobre la banda. El teléfono satelital intentó conectar y devolvió silencio. El mundo se achicó a madera, hierro, humo, lana, respiraciones, ese latido mecánico del generador que parecía marcar los minutos con un dedo firme. El frío trepaba por los umbrales aunque el hierro de la estufa ardía rojo. Lila le habló a Nora de imágenes amables, para sujetar el ánimo, tazas de chocolate espeso, el sonido de la lluvia en techos de chapa durante el verano, un perro cansado roncando a los pies de la cama. Nora respondió con una mirada húmeda, apenas un gesto, suficiente para indicar que escuchaba. Elias bebió 2 sorbos ínfimos desde la tapa del termo, y se quedó mirando la llama como si en ese amarillo pudiera leerse una promesa. Titan levantó la cabeza, olfateó, y volvió a apoyar el hocico en las patas, pero su cola estaba rígida, antena de una señal que aún no llegaba a las personas. Caleb encendió la linterna grande, ajustó el arnés del cuchillo, ató una cuerda al pasamanos del porche, para no perderse en la pared blanca si tenía que salir, y le pidió a Tessa que apilara sacos contra la puerta trasera por si el viento lograba forzarla. La madera se quejó, el techo crujió con la presión de la nieve, y el generador, como si escuchara la conversación del viento, tosió una vez antes de recuperar el pulso con un bramido obstinado. Fuera no quedaba horizonte, el mundo se había reducido al círculo tembloroso que dibujaba la linterna, cuando alguien asomaba al porche a escuchar. Ese alguien fue Titan. El Malinois pegó el hocico a la rendija inferior, olió, y luego se tensó de la nuca a la cola, un arco alerta que Lila reconoció al instante. Gruñó con una vibración sorda y miró a Caleb con prisa. El guardabosques abrió apenas la hoja, lo justo para que el perro se deslizara entre la nieve como una flecha. Lila, con gorro y bufanda, se quedó en el umbral sosteniendo la cuerda atada al poste, los ojos entornados ante un aire que cortaba como vid. La luz de la linterna,
Apenas lograba morder la blancura a 2 metros. Un bulto cruzó el haz en diagonal, se detuvo, retrocedió, volvió a avanzar con pasos cortos como de quien tantea el suelo para encontrar madera bajo polvo. Titán dejó de gruñir y empezó a ladrar, no el ladrido alto de juego, sino uno grave, perfecto, espaciado, que construía un muro invisible en medio de la tempestad. El bulto vaciló, Lila no alcanzó a ver rostro, solo una capucha oscura, y la forma de un brazo que se llevó algo al cuerpo. Caleb salió lo justo para colocarse al lado de Titán, con la linterna baja, de manera que el desconocido viera la luz sin ver desde donde nacía. El viento cambió de dirección y abrió una ventana breve. En ella brilló el borde de metal de una hoja que tiraba a gris azulado. El desconocido dio un paso. Titán avanzó 2, enseñó los dientes, y el ladrido se volvió un chasquido del aire. El bulto patinó y algo cayó de su mano. Un golpe seco en la nieve dura, un destello, un clic del mecanismo al chocar contra ella. El perro no saltó al cuello, no mordió, solo siguió ladrando con ese compás que intimida más que el ataque. La figura retrocedió borrosa, giró y se perdió en la sábana de copos como si la hubiera tragado la ladera. Caleb agarró a Titán del arnés y se agachó a palpar el suelo. Sus dedos encontraron un cuchillo plegable pesado, de cuerpo oscuro con manchas que el frío no había conseguido apagar del todo. Lo alzó con 2 guantes, lo envolvió en un paño y se metió de nuevo, cerrando con el hombro para vencer la resistencia del ventarrón. Tessa trancó la puerta con un listón y una cuña. Lila limpió la hoja con un trapo seco, y tomó una foto en la mesa para dejar constancia del estado. El perro se sacudió, lanzó una última advertencia hacia el porche y regresó a su puesto de centinela frente a la puerta. Dentro el silencio que sigue a un susto tardó en diluirse. El generador marcó otra racha, la estufa chasqueó, y la lámpara del mapa zumbó con su hilo viejo. La radio volvió a intentarlo durante un segundo, ya no en frecuencia limpia sino con un murmullo confuso, hasta apagarse por completo. Caleb, con la mandíbula apretada, hizo inventario. 2 armas cortas con pocos cargadores, un viejo fusil de cerrojo con munición suficiente para un asedio breve, bengalas, cuerdas, clavos, tablones, un par de visores nocturnos algo vencidos. Elías, todavía débil, pidió incorporarse un poco, y señaló el ventanuco que daba al cobertizo de herramientas. Sugirió clavar una madera cruzada, y colocar una cuerda con campanillas improvisadas, usando cartuchos vacíos y arandelas para levantar ruido si alguien intentaba forzar aquel lado. Caleb aprobó la idea con un gesto. Tessa trajo tornillos, y entre los 3 levantaron una barrera rápida que crujió al asentarse. Lila volvió a hablar con Nora, acercó el termo, humedeció labios con 2 gotas y mantuvo la voz suave, como si cada palabra pudiera tener la función de man. Le describió la luz que vendría por la mañana cuando escampara, el brillo azul de las crestas cuando el sol rompe una neblina baja, el olor dulzón del café en una cocina pequeña, las manos viejas de su abuelo partiéndole una galleta a Titán en el porche. Nora respiró más hondo, cerró los ojos, asintió despacio. El viento golpeó otra vez la antena y ésta respondió con un gemido de metal estirado. El silencio posterior fue absoluto. No había forma de llamar a la carretera, no había manera de avisar a agentes, ni de pedir un traslado de emergencia. El puesto, sólido como una caja fuerte, se había convertido en una isla en mitad de una marea de cristal helado. Caleb colocó una mesa volcada como parapeto delante de la ventana principal. Dejó el fusil apoyado a una distancia a la que alcanzaba, sin apartarse de la estufa, y le pidió a Tessa que apagara el interior del pasillo trasero para que nadie desde fuera obtuviera silencio. Elías, con las manos temblando menos, revisó el cuchillo recogido del porche y dijo que aquel modelo lo usaban conductores que trabajaban con lonas. El detalle pequeño se clavó en el tablero mental de Caleb como una chincheta, muy cerca. Se movían personas relacionadas con carga. Titán volvió a olfatear, pero esta vez no ladró, emitió un quejido bajo señal de presencia múltiple a distancia, y apoyó el hocico en la madera sin apartar los ojos de la unión de la puerta. El aire traía olores que los humanos no podían leer. Aceite fresco, goma tabaco con un toque anisado, lana mojada, cuero barato. Lila notó el cambio en el perro y se llevó el dedo a los labios. Caleb apagó la lámpara del mapa. La oscuridad quedó dibujada solo por brasa. Una sombra pasó por fuera, otra le siguió con un desplazamiento casi imperceptible, y luego un golpe corto retumbó en el lado del cobertizo, como si alguien tanteara con una barra el punto exacto donde la tabla se une a la pared. Tessa tomó una bengala, la cargó junto a la puerta, y esperó la señal. Caleb contó en silencio hasta 5, abrió de golpe, lanzó el cilindro hacia la nieve y cerró. La luz roja explotó detrás del talud, y pintó figuras fugaces moviéndose en negativo. Titan ladró 2 veces, y volvió a plegarse junto a Lila. Nadie corrió hacia ellos. El destello generó retroceso. Un rozo sordo indicó retirada rápida hacia el límite del pin. Elías susurró que el objetivo de quienes rondaban no era entrar a cualquier precio, sino medir resistencia, forzar miedo, buscar rendijas. No nos romperán por dentro, dijo Caleb con calma seca, y al decirlo, la casa pareció encoger tensión. Lila siguió junto a Nora, le contuvo la mano, y habló de volver a casa cuando pasara el temporal, de un paseo por el arroyo cuando se derritieran los bordes, de Titan chapoteando con dignidad fingida. Afuera el resplandor de la bengala se fue consumiendo hasta quedar solo un punto rojo enterrado por copos. La noche retomó su dominio total, y el silencio volvió a oler a humo y a metal. El generador sostuvo su latido en la pen. Caleb y Elías repasaron otra vez las defensas. Madera cruzada, cuerda con cascabeles, improvisados, bengalas restantes, munición contada, posiciones repartidas. Titan guardó la puerta sin cerrar los ojos. Afuera hombres de van cerraban el cerco, pacientes, fríos, implacables ahora.
Dawn thinned the storm into a grainy veil, as Caleb led the small column off the ridge toward the forgotten lumberyard. The map in his head clicking into place with every cut in the crust, and every scar where a heavy sled had chewed past the switchback. Nora and Elias moved with stubborn focus, warmed by Owen's careful prep and bound by their own need to see the trail of harm to its source, while Lila kept a hand on Titan's harness, whispering steady things about heat, cocoa, and a stove that would be waiting when this was over, and the dog guided them with that quiet, decisive gait he wore when the work felt like truth. The yard appeared as a pocket of flattened snow ringed by dark timber and rusting frames, with a crane arm angled like a frozen question, a pair of sheds patched with mismatched planks, and a track gouged toward a rear gate. Titan halted, nose high, then pulled left past the old office, where a broken window wore ice like blind glass, toward a low building whose door had a newer hasp and a drift trimmed by a boot edge, the kind of subtle tidy that pretends wind did the cleaning. Caleb signaled hold, studied print depth, and eased the door with the back of his glove. Hinges sighed, a smell of oil and sap drifted out, and a scatter of papers on a bench glinted with the faint arrogance of forged neatness. Lila closed the door behind them to a pencil gap, and kept to Titan's shoulder while Nora covered the far corner and Elias watched the window slit. On the bench lay manifests stamped with tidy, lying dates, and a letterhead that had slid through the story like a shark's fin. Vance Legis set above columns of routes that crossed nowhere, roads at impossible hours and signatures that matched too perfectly to belong to living hands. Under the bench, a trail of splinters made a strange, deliberate arc, as if a broom had been used to erase a circle and then had lost interest. Titan pawed once, then again, and the pattern broke open to reveal a recessed steel panel dressed with wood-grain paint. A trapdoor hinged to quiet mechanisms that hummed under the shed's breath. Caleb found the recessed handle, tested the weight, glanced at Lila, who passed him a pry bar, and shifted with Titan to the lee of a crate, while Nora braced behind the bench and Elias checked the yard through a slit that showed only pale light and the stiff tail of the crane. The panel lifted with a slow, protesting seal, and cold air breathed up from a shaft lined with bolted plates. At the bottom, a narrow vault glowed with a medical chill, lit by strips behind wire, crates stacked in obsessive rows, and a desk with a hardened case handcuffed to its leg. Caleb slid down a ladder, boots ticking on rungs, and found the case locked with a keypad and thumb pad. On the desk, a ledger weighted with columns that hummed like confession, purchase orders tied to shell firm, convoy schedules routed around checkpoints, by minutes that matched the gaps on county logs, and a note clipped to the cover with a name that hung like a threat over every line. Nathan. Above, wood creaked with a cautious human shift, the kind a frightened ally makes when courage and habit collide. And then the door opened on shoulders that carried the same family bone and a face that had crossed from pride into damage. While the brothers pretended winter alone caused the distance, Nathan held a pistol at low ready, which meant he wanted to look like a guard but still hoped someone would take the weight from his hand. Caleb said his name without accusation, and Lila's chin lifted because she had only heard him in sharp stories. Nathan's eyes moved to his niece, then to Titan, then to the manifest stack, then to the lifted panel, and the gun wandered up a fraction before shame tugged it down again. He closed his hand around my roads, Nathan said in a voice that scraped, and I told myself it was temporary leverage, just to survive a quarter, just to keep mills open, just to finish one contract. And then every signature wrote me deeper into his ledger. When Nora and Elias started asking about night runs, I thought I could stall him, but he sent drivers who would box anyone who got in the way. Caleb let the words sit without relief, neither absolution nor blade, because the room needed truth, not rage. Titan watched the door with a steady, hostile calm, and Lila kept her palm on his collar like a small anchor tying heart to duty. From the lot a horn bleated a short coat, then engines rolled, then cut, then doors thudded with that particular confidence hired men wear when they believe paperwork will scrub any stain. Nora took position at the vault rim, and Elias set his shoulder to the latch on the side door, while Nathan backed away from the main gap and lifted both hands, gun pinched between fingers like something he no longer wanted to own. A voice rose through the seam with salesman warmth, and the kind of timing that always sounds like a practiced smile rubbed on velvet, promising easy solutions, quick fixes, and oblivion for anyone patient enough to step aside. Vance did not bother to name himself because money and myth had already done the introduction. All that paper belongs to my auditor, the voice sang, and anyone bleeding on my yard belongs to the road home. Bring them out and let weather cover what's left, and I will forget you wandered onto a private route. Caleb cut the lights with a hand flick and let gloom sharpen edges, then mapped the interior out loud with clipped calm. Lanes to hold, sight lines to deny, targets to ignore, bullet traps to avoid. Lila would smash bulbs near the door to blind the first rush. Titan would flood the threshold with barking to break nerve. Nora would hold the vault ridge to keep hands off the case. Elias would watch the side slit and cut tires, if a bumper tried to kiss the wall. Nathan would keep low and name voices, because inside knowledge would shorten the path through the dark. The door jumped, a bar scraped, a flare clinked in, and spun red sparks. Lila snatched the hissing cylinder with a mitten, and drop-kicked it back into the storm where heat died in a hiss under crust. Titan detonated into a wall of sound, exploding the entry with force that shoved men backward on reflex. A muzzle showed, and a round snapped past the bench and stitched splinters off a post before Elias shattered a tail lamp, with a single round that changed the math from swagger to flinch. You are stepping into a federal hole, Nora called, voice iron over gravel, badge catching one hard stripe of white from the shaft, and the name Federal landed like an old god among men who usually used sheriff's cousins to fix tickets. Vance's warm tenor cooled to something brittle as tires spun a half-turn, then stopped because sirens reached the gate from two sides at once, blue bars painting the crane arm with cold lightning, and a bullhorn answered his pitch with measured comptroller patience that did not care about charisma. Agents flowed through the breach in a wedge that had nothing frantic in it, only work. Commands cracked, hands rose, knees kissed slush, and plastic cuffs whispered while paperwork found living wrists. One man tried to slip the blind side, and met Titan's roar in a light that made his pupils scream, and he went down into a drift with a grunt that sounded like a choice collapsing. Vance stepped out smooth as silk, palms eyes bright with calculation, winter coat curated to signal philanthropy, boots practical enough to hint at an origin myth, and a smile pitched to the nearest camera that would never love him back. He started with the line every polished criminal learns,
misunderstood subcontractor mischief, clerical confusion, and found it curdled when an agent lifted the case and read off a ledger line that matched a time, a spur, a set of plates, and a hospital admission, the kind of coincidence prosecutors mount on easel. Nathan sagged against a crate and slid the pistol toward Caleb with the toe of his boot like a man returning a knife to a kitchen he refuses to enter again. Lila watched his face with a hurt that knew love and anger can occupy the same chest, and Titan exhaled a hard breath that emptied the room of one more illusion. A brief scuffle flared near the gate when two drivers tried to run the old track. The tires met a chain laid in a hurry by hands that had done this dance in other counties. A bumper kissed iron. A door flew wide. An agent spoke a sentence that ended with the word down, and momentum abandoned bravado, as if a plug had been pulled from its belly. Snow began again, a fine ash floating through the frame. As the vault's contents climbed into evidence boxes, one label at a time, Nora rested back against a post and let the reality land in stages. Elias took a long, slow breath that chose not to rattle. Caleb looked at his brother and saw a man with the ledger ink, still wet on his fingers, asking if truth could be paid in full, and Lila slid her cheek against Titan's ear and told him, soft, they had held the line until help arrived because that was the promise from the first bark on the rig. Vance watched the brothers with a small, failing smile, then asked for counsel in a voice shorn of its showroom shine. An agent pointed to a van and noted the request for a body camera with a date and a time. Doors closed with a hush that felt like a curtain finally falling. In the shadows, the trapdoor stood open on a cellar that had pretended to be a rumor. And the old yard, once a mouth that swallowed timber and spit money, wore a new shape, a courtroom drawn on snow by boots, cuffs and numbered bags. Caleb squeezed Nathan's shoulder. Not absolution, not fear, only the hard mercy of a man who will walk beside a brother to a witness stand. Lila looked up at the crane arm framed by flurries, and thought about how fast courage can be tested, and how stubborn hope can be when a child, and a handful of grown people decide a mountain will not erase the truth they drag from under its skin.
The cuffs closed on Vance, with a quiet click that seemed louder than the storm. Agents walked him across the yard, while blue strobes washed the snow. The hardened case from the trapdoor vault rode in a labeled bin, the ledger on top like a throat cleared in court. He tried the curated smile, but the morning showed seams, not charm. Nora and Elias signed chain of custody forms with steady hands. Lila stood with Titan pressed to her leg, touching the new tag on his collar, as if it were a compass that pointed toward home. Caleb watched the line of vehicles turn, and felt the ridge finally release the breath it had been holding since the first bark in the drift. Nathan stayed in the shed doorway, gun already tagged. Shame moved across his face, then steadied. No more hedging, he said. I'll testify. Caleb nodded once. Titan sat between the brothers like a hinge, tail still, eyes watchful. The procedure gathered speed. Agents copied ledgers, matched signatures, traced wires through shell firms with oatmeal names. A magistrate denied bail, describing a talent for vanishing favors. The county sealed the spur. The ridge held still, relieved to see the mess boxed and labeled. 2 weeks later, the courthouse smelled of wet wool. Nathan told the grand jury how discounts became threats, how convoys moved inside gaps on patrol logs, how a soft voice made every no feel final. He did not excuse a single stroke of his pen. He named drivers, Mills, and Vance. When he finished, he looked at Lila and bowed his head like a man returning a borrowed tool. Outside, children held signs that read "Thank you, Lila," and "Good dog, Titan." The mayor pinned a citation to Lila's parka and clipped a new tag to Titan, engraved with the ridge coordinates. "For loyalty," she said. The Malinois accepted the weight like a ritual. Nora hugged Lila carefully. Elias promised Titan a steak when Salt returned to his diet. Phones lifted. A cheer rolled across the steps. "Who's a hero in your life? Tag them below." Nora returned to light duty, voice clear. Elias traded the cane for a steady gait. They visited the outpost with a bakery box and left with a photo of everyone by the stove, cheeks bright, the mast behind them, like a metronome. Tessa tacked one copy to the map wall. Owen labeled "Another Winter's We Won," and filed it where he keeps proof that effort matters. Reconciliation needed its own map. Caleb drove Nathan to the hospital on a day so clear the mountains looked newly forged. Jonah Crane lay under a window, with a square of sky and machines whispering. Age had paired him to essentials, but his gaze still set lines true. Caleb told the story in even strokes. The drift, the vault, the arrest, the promise to stand and speak. Nathan stood at the rail like a boy at a closed gate, trying to swallow years of silence. Jonah lifted a thin hand and set it on his wrist. I taught you fences, he said, not walls. Nathan's answer broke, then found footing. He confessed the shortcuts that grew teeth, the quiet that became habit, the fear that let coercion masquerade as contract. I'll pay with truth, he said. Jonah's eyes watered and cleared. Do that, he said. Then come set posts when the thaw comes. Caleb laughed once in relief, and then wiped his face as if the weather had blown through the room. Lila and Titan waited in the hall where disinfectant smelled like snow on steel. The dog leaned into her legs when voices rose, then relaxed as they fell back to ordinary talk. A nurse scratched Titan and asked for the story again. Lila told the short version, the one that leaves room for listeners' courage. When Caleb waved them in, Jonah reached for Titan with papery fingers, and the dog bowed as if answering a command from long ago. Good partner, Jonah said. Good girl. Spring arrived by inches. The creek found its voice. Fences shed ice, and the ridge stepped out of white armor. A federal letter confirmed what the plea implied. The spur would be closed, the yard dismantled, the slope replanted and protected. Vance traded suits for a jumpsuit, and reset his smile to neutral. The ledgers that once felt invincible, read like a diary of small greed, repeated until it sounded like law. Nathan signed cooperation papers, opened his books, and shut down contracts that smelled wrong even when the math looked tight. He stood on the mill floor and told his crew that the company would build with clean timber and cleaner books, or not at all. No one applauded. They went back to work with a steadier rhythm. On a Saturday with light like water, the town held a picnic. Kids braided paracord into a new collar for Titan. A choir sang a tune with no name, that everyone knew anyway. Nora spoke about stubborn breath and being found. Elias about second chances arriving on sled runners. Caleb about weather and purpose. Nathan about the cost of silence. Lila crouched beside Titan and pressed her forehead to his, listening to the drum of his old precise heart. The mayor rang the polished mill bell, and the sound carried into the trees like a bright line drawn on the air. That evening the brothers returned to the hospital. Jonah napped with his mouth open, woke, and asked for the gist as if the day were a radio show he trusted. Caleb handed him a photo, the two sons replacing a warped board in the outpost fence, while a girl and a dog laughed in the background. Jonah held it until his tremor settled. Good posts, he said. Good rails. He laid the picture on his chest and blessed them with the old words he had used when tires burst and knees bled, and winters felt endless. Night pooled at the window, patient and kind. The machines kept time. Nathan promised Jonah he would testify again and again, until the truth felt ordinary. Caleb promised to call when the first green pushed through the replanted soil. Jonah closed his eyes like a man ready to nap on a porch after a storm. Lila stood with one hand on Titan's head, and understood that courage was not loud. It was the small promises kept when no one watched. When they stepped into the corridor, the world smelled of hand soap and coffee and cedar. The elevator outside, the ridge wore the soft green that comes only after a hard winter. Lila touched Titan's tag and read the numbers under her breath. The dog looked up as if to say, yes, I remember. They walked into the evening, not toward an ending, but toward the long, patient work that follows a narrow escape, mending fences, telling truth, keeping watch. Above them the sky kept its quiet ledger, and marked the days measured by small right choices. Weeks later, sentencing made headlines, and then faded, like storms after fences are mended, and trails reopen. The yard came board by board. Seedlings went in with names on flags. School kids learned to say restoration like a promise. Lila kept Titan's tag polished and his water bowl full. When strangers thanked her, she quietly pointed to those who answered the radio. Titan blinked, leaned and listened for weather, as if duty were a compass.
he would never put down. The ridge exhaled, and spring carried their vows forward together onward.
Spring loosened the ridge from winter's iron, and the mountains breathed like giants waking after a long fast, as meltwater threaded bright silver through old drifts and saplings, lifted green flags where loaders once groaned. A state placard at the trailhead named the watershed protected. The spur road closed and the yard dismantled by federal order, and those plain lines felt like a hymn in work boots. Lila read every sentence aloud to Titan, touching the raised seal with mittened fingers, while Caleb, Nathan, Nora, and Elias listened under a sky rinsed clean. They walked the new boundary in quiet gratitude, boots crunching over thawed needles and wet grit, past stakes painted orange, fresh mounds ringed by straw, and signs promising stewardship rather than extraction. Nathan named trees he had once treated like inventory, and now greeted like kin: ponderosa, lodgepole, tamarack, speaking softly about depositions ahead, restitution funds, and the kind of disciplined repairs honest ledgers require when shortcuts have written scars into land and lives. Caleb described crews mapping erosion, reseeding slopes in chevrons to hold rain, twisting wire around young trunks to keep elk from browsing, and hauling scrap from gullies until the creek ran clear as glass held to light. Nora explained how sealed exhibits would fix Vance's schemes to dates, routes, plates, invoices, and faces, while Elias sketched the old staging pattern in the air, showing school kids how a crime can hide in routine until someone says stop, look, listen, count. The town spread quilts on the green at noon, and a carpenter lifted a crossbar engraved with the ridge's coordinates, and a promise that mountains can learn peace. A teacher read a brief account of the raid, not to celebrate danger, but to give faithful work its due. The mayor thanked medics, rangers, clerks, neighbors, and the anonymous voices who kept radios alive through nights when quitting seemed like good sense. Then she called Lila and Titan forward and pinned a small silver token to the girl's jacket, while clipping a new tag to the dog's collar, engraved with 2 words, loyal partner, and a line of numbers only they would memorize at the stove. Like a family prayer, the cheer rolled warm and unscripted across benches and into trees. Who's a hero in your life? Tag them below. Someone shouted from the steps, and laughter mingled with tears because the question had answers in every row. Nurses who held doors during storms, plow drivers who never slept, cashiers who kept lights friendly, teachers who learned every name, fathers who apologized, brothers who chose truth. Later, they drove to the hospital where Jonah dozed under a window full of blue, woke as the footsteps reached his door, and smiled the way men smile when a long measure finally resolved. Nathan stood straight at the rail and said he would testify again and again until every ledger read clean. Caleb added news about seedlings taking the creek's clarity after thaw, the workshop teaching kids to count rings without cutting trunks. Nora set a photograph of the vault open under halogen bars by the cup of ice chips, and Elias laid a laminated map beside it, with red dots marking seizures across counties that once looked the other way. Jonah took Lila's hand and Titan's collar at the same time, eyes wet, voice steady. Grace multiplies, he said. You met night with duty and kept moving until day had a chance. Lila leaned into the bed rail and felt the truth of it under her ribs. Courage had not been a shout in wind, but a promise kept one small step at a time, and the miracle had not been lightning, but the exact meeting of a child, a dog, a father, 2 wounded detectives, and a handful of stubborn helpers who refused to let the ridge erase names. Evening brought a clean wind through pine boughs, and shadows drifted across flats like grazing herds. Back at the outpost they stacked tools, planed a warped gate, plank until the grain shone, and chalked cut lines side by side without friction. Brothers trading measure and mallet, like music after a quarrel no one wanted anymore. Lila brewed cocoa, slipped cinnamon into the pot, divided a biscuit with Titan, and watched Nora catch a weather report that predicted nothing dramatic, just fair sky, honest chill, and a thaw that would take its time, while Elias set a single spent shell on the mantel as a small vow. No more night runs on stolen timber, no more boxes moving like lies between trees. They stepped onto the porch as stars scattered wide enough to forgive mistakes. The mast hummed at a friendly pitch. The creek's talk returned, breath plumed and softened. Lila pressed her forehead to Titan's and thanked him for the 1,000 quiet decisions he made without glory, where to stay, when to bark, how to make strangers choose retreat, by the weight of his gaze. She thanked Caleb for hand signals learned in calm before weather rose. She thanked Nora and Elias for breathing. Until help arrived, she thanked Nathan for putting down the shape that had nearly unmade him, and picking up heavy, but clean. She thought about Grace like a current moving under everything, carrying small choices toward repair even when fear insists on shortcuts. She thought about miracles like timing that opens doors at the last second, about ledgers rewritten by confession, about scars that no longer sting when the work ahead has purpose. Dawn found them in the same place, marveling at a ridge that felt both new and old. By week's end, sentencing would set a term that made headlines, and then faded, as such stories do when land begins to heal and people return to ordinary kindness. Crews would peel the yard down to concrete, tilt broken frames into trucks, sift nails from soil with magnets, and spread straw over fresh seed. Children would learn the word restoration, and point at trout slipping through clear bends. Nathan would face rooms where eyes searched his face for shortcuts, and be relieved to have none to offer. Caleb would read permits with the patience of a farmer who knows rain comes when it comes. Nora would testify with a voice like iron wrapped in linen. Elias would build a lesson plan titled Paper Pattern Proof. Lila would keep Titan's tag polished and his water bowl full, and at night she would whisper one remembered line into his ear. Good partner, and he would lean into her legs with that old precise heart-beating time. Spring stitched a bright seam through every broken place they could reach. Hope did not erase consequence. It braided consequence to mercy and asked them to walk forward together. The ridge, declared protected and free of smuggling, wore its slow green like absolution. Lila, Caleb, Nathan, Nora and Elias stood beneath the crossbar carved with coordinates, and a verse about mountains learning peace. Hands linked without ceremony, and let silence say the rest. They had been spared. They had worked, they would keep watch. Titan sat between them, quiet as a stone warmed by a faithful hand, amber eyes soft, ears pricked to the creek and the road, and the wind through pine. The girl who followed him into a drift and changed the story of a county lifted her chin toward a sky, rinsed clean and smiled because grace had proven stronger than fear. And the miracle after all the noise was simply this: love chose the long work and refused to let go. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment amen if you believe in second chances. Subscribe to join our journey of courage and miracle.